Greetings, you patient motion people, and welcome to another Cinema4D Soik. It's a massive multi-part tutorial series starring Cinema4D, After Effects, X-Particles, and Turbulence FD, all starting in Houdini. So sit your Cinema4D ass down, because we've got volcanoes to make. Allow me to introduce Houdini. Now, I'm not going to tell you about every gadget and gizmo in here, because, to be honest, I don't know what most of them do, but that's exactly the point of this tutorial. You hardly need to know anything to be able to create a whole-ass volcano in Houdini. But I believe some brief introductions are in order. Number one, this big square over here is essentially like the Cinema4D viewport, but in Houdini it's called the scene view. You can navigate it pretty much the same way as in Cinema4D. Option left click orbits things, option right click moves you in and out, and then option middle mouse click pans you around. Now, if you ever get lost, two keys are going to be important to you, A and F. A frames all objects in the scene, F only frames the selected objects in the scene. Alright, let's look over to our right here. We've got two grey boxes here. We've got the parameters over here, and we've got our objects network view below it. Now, in this objects view is where all the action is going to happen. All your stuff goes into this, for now, empty network. And then in the parameter panels, it's all about how the action happens. This is where you change pretty much all of the parameters for the objects in your scene. Alright, congratulations, you're now certified to use Houdini, so let's go. The very first thing to do is to create a Heightfield node in your objects panel. Now, to create a node, we can either right-click inside here and scroll down to the node we want. Ours is under Terrain, Heightfield. And then just slap that into our scene and drop it where we want it. Or we can simply hit Tab and type in Heightfield, and we can also drop it in that way. Now I'm going to double click right here where it says Heightfield, and that allows me to rename it to something proper, like Volcano. Right, so if we were to select that node simply by clicking on it, we finally get some parameters in the parameters panel. Now, there's not that much fun going on here, it's just the standard position, scale, rotation type parameters. Not much fun. So what we need to do is go deeper. In Houdini, you can select and double click on just about any node, and get to the nodes underneath the nodes that create that node. It's kind of like a nodes in nodes in nodes in nodes. Yeah, so if we do that for our Heightfield, what do we find if not another Heightfield? Now, it might not look it, but this Heightfield is far more exciting. This is where all the stuff is going to happen. Now, let's go into our scene view here and press F to frame that selected Heightfield. And for now, it's not much, really. It's just a blank canvas for us to create our landscape on. By the way, you use the same buttons that you navigate the scene view to also navigate the objects panel. So, select with left click and drag, of course. But a right click zooms you in and out, and a middle mouse click pans you around. And you can also have nodes selected and hit F to frame those. If you've got nothing selected, hitting F frames all nodes. Right, so here we are with our canvas. Now, any canvas, we need to decide how big it's going to be. As with any canvas, we need to choose the right size canvas to do our painting on. So let's have a look at these parameters. There's a few of them, but the main ones to look at are the size of the canvas and the division mode and grid spacing. Now, in Houdini, most of the time you can assume that units are in metric meters. So right now our height field is 1000 by 1000 meters. That's 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. And this is going to be important later on, because anything to do with physics in Houdini also assumes that you're working with meters. So that's going to affect how your physics happen. Now I'm going to create a sort of Fuji-like mountain, and I happen to know that the area around Fuji is about 20,000 by 20,000 meters big. That's 20 by 20 kilometers. I will enter that into the size. And you'll notice that it is now huge, and also it has become awfully slow. I'm just going to frame the whole thing. Yeah, quite slow. And that is because of this other parameter, division mode and grid spacing. Now, grid spacing is set to 2, which means that every 2 meters, it starts a new polygon. So this little square has about 100 million polygons, a bit more than we need at this stage. So if we change the division mode from by size to by axis, we get a grid samples option instead, and we can set the exact resolution we want this to have. So by default it has 512 by 512 polygons, which is perfect for us to begin with. Now that concludes the setup of the canvas. Look how much smoother it is now. Alright, so our canvas is set up. Now let's paint. And that's not actually a metaphor. I'm going to create a node called Heightfield Paint. Alright, now we've got two nodes. So the main thing you need to know about working with nodes is that you plug one into the other. So we'll plug our height field into our Heightfield Paint. Everything is calculating downwards, so first the height field is created and then we start painting on it. But before we get to painting, let's talk a bit about what these buttons are. This technology, what is it all about? So these buttons are actually called flags. First one here is the bypass flag. It turns on the bypass, which means that the node itself is disabled, but it's still passing through information from the previous nodes. Now the second one is this red one. It locks the node. And it's kind of like a temporary current state object. It stops the node from simulating again, or cooking as Houdini calls it. But it can also be turned off. Now let's jump to this last one here. This is the display/render flag. So if you check that one, it decides which one of the nodes within the network is actually being outputted. And that is important further up in the hierarchy, because right now we are inside our Volcano object. So if we go up one level through this navigation bar up here, we see our Volcano object here. And depending on which node in the Volcano object has its display flag active, that's the one whose data gets passed along. Now there is this little purple flag as well. That is called a template flag. And if I turn that on for our Heightfield Paint node, it doesn't really do much. So let me call up a pig real quick. Turn the display tag on so we can see it, but then we just frame it with F, and here is our pig. Now if we turn on this template tag for our pig, and we reactivate the Heightfield Paint node, we can still see a mesh of the object with the template tag on. That is particularly useful if you want to have a tiny pig's head in the middle of a massive empty landscape. Alright, so we have officially gotten lost. Let's delete the pig, we don't need that. Select the Heightfield Paint and press F, and we're back to where we are. Finally, in addition to these flags, most nodes have this little info button, and that is literally a bunch of information. In this case, we can see the resolution of our height field and a bunch of other stuff. Alright, now where is my paintbrush? We've got the Heightfield Paint node selected, but obviously we need a brush to be able to paint. Now if you just look to the left of the scene view here, you can notice that the camera tool is highlighted. And to conjure up a paintbrush, you simply pick this one instead. It's called Show Handles. And with that, we get a tiny, tiny red dot that we can use to simply draw on our landscape. Now that's obviously far too tiny, so we'll Command or Control Z to get rid of that. So we can scroll up or down to increase or decrease the radius. And then draw a nice little squiggle. Left mouse button applies the foreground value and the middle mouse button applies the background value, which is right now set to 0. So if I middle mouse button that, it will start to erase what I've drawn. Right, so that's quite a nice doodle, but obviously it's not a landscape yet. So how does one turn a squiggle into a landscape? It's at this point that we need yet another node. We're going to hit Tab and enter Heighfield Remap. Drop that in, and let's move the Heighfield Paint out of the way a little bit. Because now we want to plug the height field right into the main input of the Heighfield Remap. And the Heighfield Paint goes into the second input, which is for masks. Let's activate this Heighfield Remap. Now this node allows us to change the height of our landscapes. Obviously everything is 0 right now, and we want to change that, but everything being 0 means that the inputs don't matter, and everything that matters is the output minimum. Set that to 100 maybe. Now we can start seeing a few little shapes coming out of the landscape. And which parts are affected by this remap is controlled by the painting we've done using the Heightfield Paint. So if we were to set this even higher, we've now got 3-dimensional shapes. And if we again select the Heightfield Paint, we can keep painting in real time and adding more shapes to this. Look, I just made myself a little crypto art. But to be honest, this doesn't look anything like a mountain. So let's set the height to what it's supposed to be in our Heightfield Remap. I happen to know that the prominence of Mount Fuji compared to its surrounding area is 3.8 kilometers. So output minimum needs to be set to 3,800 meters. Let's hop back to our painting node and reset those strokes and set it up proper. Foreground and background values are all okay, but I want to turn the opacity well down. Because now that I'm going to do the real mountain, I want to work in very light strokes. And I'm using a tablet, so I'm going to turn the opacity pressure and radius pressure both down. Otherwise, the thickness and opacity is going to depend on how hard I press down on the pen, which easily gets a bit confusing in 3 dimensions. Now I want the radius a little bit up. And then I will start painting the simplest possible volcano shape I can. Because all the details are going to be added automatically by other lovely nodes. So I'm literally just making a pile in the middle, adding a few extra details to the landscape around. Of course, adding the crater right at the top. And then here right at the end, I'm adding a bit of a ravine, just because I want a bit of a distinctive character feature. But other than that, I'm just literally keeping it as simple as I can. Alright, now let's add the actual details, and you know what that means. Time for another node. And this time it is a Heightfield Noise node that I'm going to create. I will plug that right in after the Heighfield Remap and activate that. I will rename it Hills because that's exactly what it's going to add for us. Now it does have loads of parameters that you can use to create very many different types of noises. Right now it's creating this sort of general wibble wobble, which is fine, but not what we want. So we'll change the noise type from sparse convolution to a Worley cellular F1, which creates these almost sand dune-like peaks all over the landscape. Now I want the roughness of that noise to be very high, which adds a little bit more fine detail on the tippy tops of it. And I want the I don't think I've ever pronounced this word, lacunarity to also be quite high. Then I will increase the overall element size massively and also turn up the amplitude to match. And then to keep our landscape from actually sinking down under the ground, I will uncheck the center noise option. So that's literally just adding noise on top of the landscape we have. Lovely. The only thing that isn't quite lovely is that it does affect the volcano all the way to the top. And I want these shapes to be a little bit more on the lower elevation. But you know what? We can probably fix that with another node. And in fact, what we need is another Heightfield Paint. So if I select the one we already have and I option drag that, it creates a copy of the node. And I'll plug that in right after the remap, make a little bit of space, and plug that into the mask option of the Heightfield Noise. And instantly all the hills are gone except for actually at the top of the volcano, the opposite of what we want. But if we have a look at the Heightfield Paint node and select that, we can reset the strokes, turn up the opacity, turn up the radius again, and then simply paint in the areas where we do want those hills. If we turn on the hills again, we can still keep painting on that Heightfield node and just quite simply add lovely hills wherever we want them. Alright, so we had one node for noise, but what about a second node? Let's create another Heightfield Noise node. We plug in after the hills, activate that, and we're back to this sort of general wibble wobble. And that's fine. Let's actually rename this one to Wibble Wobble we just want it slightly smaller. So we'll set both the element size to small and then the amplitude to very small. And that gives us a nice bit of general roughness, or I think the technical term is general wibble wobble. And it's really going to help give more natural erosion. And to do that erosion, you probably think that I'm going to create a new node. But you're actually completely correct, because I'm going to create a Heightfield Erode node, which I'll plug in right after the wibble wobble. Now, this is the big one. It's going to make our little turd look like a nice and lovely landscape. It's got all these different tabs, but we're mostly going to be looking at the main tab and a few parameters in the advanced tab. But before we begin, let's activate the Erode node and go up to its visualization tab and click compute range. And now is the time to start worrying about this thing down here, the timeline. Start by pressing play to see what Erode actually does. Well, out in nature, and in CG for that matter, erosion is what makes landscapes look like landscapes. You could take a cube the size of a mountain, put it out in a field, and with enough erosion, it will eventually look like a natural part of the landscape. The Heightfield Erode node simulates both water and temperature erosion, which is why nothing happened on frame 1, but now as it's playing through, it's gradually eroding the mountain more and more, and even creating small little lakes around it. Now those lakes are an effect of the water or hydro erosion. It's a ton of rainfall over eons of time that gradually eats away at the soil and bedrock of a mountain and sort of washes it away, really. But the node is also simulating thermal erosion or temperature erosion, which is what happens when rock and water keep freezing and then thawing together. Gradually this eats away at the landscape and it just sort of crumbles. A very good example of this is in Iceland, where that soft volcanic rock easily crumbles, so you get these quite soft fields of black gravelly sand with the occasional lump of volcano sticking out. Okay, so that's the basics of erosion, and the default settings work quite well. But what we want with this first pass of erosion is literally millions of years of geology. So we're going to jump all the way back to the start and change some of the settings in our height field. Starting in main, I'm going to turn up the global erosion rate to somewhere around 4, just to make the whole thing eat away at the mountain a lot quicker. And then I'm going to turn up the hydro erodibility here to 2. Because I really want those millions of years of rainfall to really eat into the mountain. The rest of the settings under main are essentially fine the way they are. But under advanced, I'm also going to turn up the removal rate all the way up to about 0.4. And that just determines how much of the soil that's being carried away is simply poof, deleted. And it's going to make the whole landscape look a bit more mountainous. Let's scroll down a little bit in these settings and look at precipitation. I want the amount there to be 1, because I want heavy rain. But then I want an evaporation rate of about 0.5, because I don't want massive flooding beneath the volcano. And now we simply sim that, just by pressing play on the timeline. And I'm just going to let nature run its course now. The rain is going to keep digging into those mountains, creating nice grooves and rivers, eventually forming into lakes. But the question is, once we reach a result that we like, how do we save that? Because the way Houdini works is that it saves the tool that you've built to create a thing, but it doesn't save the thing itself. So the next time we open this up, we would have to recalculate this all over again. But to avoid that, a lot of nodes have this freeze at frame option. Bless them. Let's just scroll up on the parameters of our Heightfield Erode and check this freeze at frame option. Right now set to 20. But we can turn that up to frame 100. But all this does is tell the node to stop simulating after frame 100. If we were to change a parameter like removal rate, or if we were to close and reopen the file, Houdini would have to cook this whole thing all over again. But to fix that, we use our friend the lock flag. So now the simulation is frozen at frame 100 and the node is locked. That simulation is not going anywhere. We can close the file, we can open it again, we can open it on a different machine. It's still going to be there. We won't have to recook the thing. All right, so that is a roughly pretty good shape, more or less. The little ravine I made looks like it's coming along nicely. But if we look too closely, we can see that it's all a bunch of splodges and not much more. And this begins the next stage, which I call unshitting the volcano. And the unshitting phase is almost the same as the details phase, except that it starts with a Heightfield Resample node. What a Heightfield Resample node does is that it resamples your height field. Shocking, I know. So our current resolution, right, is 512 by 512 polygons. And now we need to ask ourselves, how big do we actually want it? For a background mountain, maybe 512 is enough. But for this one, I'm pretty much going to split the difference and make it 4K. So I'll check the checkbox that says specify exact resolution. Now I'll also change the division mode again, so it's not by size, but it is by axis. And I will simply type in 4096 polygons. And then this filter scale down here controls how soft that scale up is. So if we were to turn that down all the way to 0, you'll see that our whole mountain is pretty jagged. I'm going to set that to something near default, but maybe a little bit less. So we still get to keep some of our sharp ridges, but it's just soft enough to not look funny. Alright, so now it's more like the details phase again. I'm going to select both the hills and the wibble wobble nodes, alt drag both of those to create a copy, and plug them in after the resampling. I don't want to use any mask on the hills, so I will delete that connection. Alright, let's turn on the hills first, see what they look like, and give those some tweaks. We want the amplitude and scale both to be quite a bit lower. The amplitude most of all, I'm going to set that to something closer to 300, and the element size, probably about 2000. So that's going to create much smaller hills in completely different places. And then I'm going to do something slightly funny. I'll change the combine method from add, which is just adding the hills on top, to subtract. And now instead of hills, we get these sort of almost crack shapes in the terrain that look quite nice, especially around the peaks of our small mountains. And these are going to have quite a nice impact on how rivers and lakes form. Now let's also change the center noise thing to actually center the noise so the landscape doesn't dip down too far. And then let's have a look at the wibble wobble. And that's mostly fine the way it is actually. It's adding even more detail to this now high-res landscape. So I think I'll leave that the way it is. Now, just like last time, it's time to erode. Now before we activate that one, let's make sure we're at the beginning of our timeline. Otherwise it will start cooking that node all the way up to the frame that you're actually on. But we are on the first frame, so it's fine to activate. Now it's all about developing the final look for the landscape. So the default settings are fine to begin with. Of course, we have to go into visualization and again compute the range. And for us to actually see how this takes shape, I'm also going to scroll down to this height ramp and get rid of most of the colors there and just have a slightly grayish white gradient instead, just to make it easier to see the actual shapes. And then we can start simulating that. Yeah, it's not the fastest at the moment, so I'm going to cancel that and jump back to the beginning. Just to get the look we want, it's fine to go into your Heightfield Resample and turn the grid samples well down. 1000 polygons is still twice the amount of polygons we had, so it's going to be enough for us to get a nice idea for the look without slowing us down too much. And then when we have the look locked in, we can turn that back up to max when it's time to export this thing. Now, even with the default settings, this second pass of erosion is looking quite promising. Because we've got all those details added in now, it's carving in really nicely to the landscape. But I am also after that specific Fuji style look. And Fuji has that nice and lovely soil at the base of the volcano. And to get some more of that good soil for nice trees, I think we need to turn up the thermal erosion a bit. Let's stop this cooking, jump back to the beginning, and in the main tab of our erosion, scroll down to the thermal erosion and I will reduce the cut angle. Lower angles basically flatten the mountain more. So I'm going to set that to the sort of mid-20s to get those slightly softer slopes. And then just let it run again. If you're a fan of 3D landscaping, it's worth taking just a whole day to play around with a bit of erosion, just to see what all the parameters do, because there's really a lot of variation that you can get out of it. Alright, so this is looking a lot more like the mountain I'm actually after. And that means, sadly, the only thing to do is to crank that resampler right back up to 4K and do the full erosion simulation. I might turn the cut angle down a little bit more. Now, instead of just playing it through and trying to find a frame that I like, I'm going to scroll directly up to freeze at frame, set that to, again, frame 100 probably, and once I check that checkbox, it will start simulating all the way up to frame 100.
I felt a great disturbance in the force, as if millions of
CPUs
suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced.
And the reason I'm doing it that way instead of just playing it through and picking a frame I like is that this landscape is quite huge now, and it's not that many frames that are going to fit into the RAM. And I don't quite want to sit here for half an hour and just watch over it. So I'm going to let this run and I will check back in once it's done. Oh, well, there it is. It was at this very moment I made a critical mistake. I did not lock the node. So the next time I opened this file, I had to wait about 40 minutes for the whole erosion to calculate again. Sadly, I cannot time travel to warn myself, but hopefully you receive this warning before you can make the same mistake. So does that mean that we're done now? Not quite yet. You see, if we zoom into some of these lake areas, you can see that they're actually a little bit bumpy. That's not like any lake I've ever seen. However, there is a quick fix to bumpy lakes in Houdini terrain. That is with something called the blur node. I'm going to plug that in right after the erosion node and activate it. And that one essentially just blurs the height field. If I crank that up, we'll see that it gets smoother and smoother. But if we also plug the erosion into the mask input on that node, we get the option of using a mask layer. And if I set that to water, I can activate the mask aware blur and turn up those iterations. Let me really turn them up. And that's only smoothing out surfaces of water, turning these nice little lakes into proper flat lakes, the way they're, normally are in the real world. But that means that we are actually done. Now we just need to get this mountain out of Houdini into our software of choice. So what do we need from Houdini to do that? Well, we need lots and lots of texture maps. We want a height map showing how tall certain parts of the terrain are. We want a slope map showing how steep certain parts of the terrain are. And we want water, debris and sediment maps from the erosion. All of those maps already exist except for the slope map. And that's as simple as, yes, adding another node. This one's called Mask by Feature. So we'll add right after the height field blur. So if we activate that, it already has the slope option checked. There are a few more options available, but we're just going to focus on slope. Right now it's only selecting a range of the angles of our slopes. What we want it to do is to select everything that goes from 0 degrees to 90 degrees steep. And we want a smooth ramp for that span. So we'll delete both of these on the remap ramp. And we'll leave the left one down at 0, and I will turn this right one all the way up. So there's a nice and smooth gradient from the flattest plains to the steepest hills. So if we scroll up here to layer bindings, we see that it's writing the mask it's creating into the mask layer. So that's all good. Now we can create our outputs. Once again, yes, let's make a node. And it's called Heightfield Output. We'll plug our entire node chain right into that. And now once again we are faced with options and parameters. First thing we want to look at is the output type. It's by default set to packed raster, and that means it saves all the different channels that we want to output into separate channels on the image. So red, green, and blue. And that's all good, but I just want to use the red, green, and blue channels. Under format, I will set it from RGBA to just RGB. And also tick the resolution checkbox to just make extra sure that the resolution is 4K precisely. So we're getting every last bit of detail that the computer has painstakingly calculated for us. Now, if you're on the non-commercial version of Houdini, there is a chance that you will only be able to output up to 960 by 960 pixels, but that's still plenty of pixels to play with. Now, let's scroll on down to the output layers, and there we have our image channels. And we can give each of those channels a certain terrain layer. And for the red channel, I will set that to the height map. Green channel, I will set to be the mask, which is our freshly made slope map. And the blue one, I'm just going to leave empty. We're going to do a separate output for all the erosion maps, so that's going to give us plenty of channels to use. Now here's a little important parameter, the output range, currently set to no remapping for both. And we actually want to set that to remap the red channel. So if it's set to manual, we'll need to enter the height of our mountain manually, which is starting at 0 meters, presumably, and then goes all the way up to 3,800. But I would recommend to just set that to auto remap and let Houdini figure out the height of the mountain for you. Alright, so that is everything we need to concern ourselves with except for actually setting an output. And that's easy enough, just click this button, pick the folder you want to save to and give it a nice and catchy name. I'll just name it after whatever the file is, followed by main. But then this bit is particularly important. With Houdini, a lot of the time you choose your file type when you choose the name. So if I was to put .exr here, Houdini is going to save that as an EXR file. Or if I put .tiff instead, it would try to save that as a TIFF file. But EXR is what we want, so EXR is what we put. I hit save on that, and simply press this big rectangular button up here that says Save to Disk. And then Houdini's just going to figure that whole thing out for me and write out a nice EXR file with my height map in the red channel and my slope map in the green channel. Alright, now we just need to repeat that same thing for our erosion maps as well. I'm going to move this output a bit to the left and rename that one main. Alt-drag that node to make a copy, which I will rename Eros. And now I'm going to save the remaining channels I want in this image. So in the red channel, I'm going to put the sediment map. Green channel, I will put the debris map. And in the blue channel, of course, I'm going to put the water map. And now for this one, we don't need to do any auto remapping, so I'm going to turn that off, even though it probably doesn't hurt. And scroll up, pick a new location for that one, and I will name that one Eros. And of course, remember to put .exr at the end, get it to be the right file type. And then once again, press that big rectangular button. After a few seconds with those amazing graphics, that one is saved as well. Now, if we import those two images into After Effects, for example, we get these nice and strange looking colorful little numbers. But if we just add a Shift Channels effect to that and look at the individual channels, we can start seeing what our maps actually looks like. And let me tell you, it's all looking pretty good. Now, if you want to use the same setup to create other landscapes, that is, of course, entirely possible. All you need to do is go further up in your hierarchy. You can, for example, change how you drew the original shape, turn that into a different, strange-looking double volcano, for instance. You can go into your various noises, scroll down and change the offset of the noise, and you'll get a completely different layout, different hills. And then just go into your erosion, unfreeze that, and wait for your new landscape to cook. And of course, don't be afraid to tweak some of those erosion settings too. It's always worth having a play. Certainly hope you enjoyed dipping your toe into Houdini as much as I did. The next couple of tutorials are going to be much more familiar ground when we're continuing our landscapes in After Effects, creating massive tileable landscape textures. So until next time, thank you for your time, and of course, stay in motion. If If you like these tutorials and you want to support the work, the best thing to do is to tell every freelancer you know about the Process of Motion course. It's going to help them make better projects that are more well paid for much happier clients. There's a link to the course in the description.